Hello, welcome to another edition of Ravens Roosting, Words and Music with POJ. I'm Paul Jenkins, University Librarian. And today I will be talking to you about the White Album by the Beatles, released in 1968. And this presentation is sort of a variation on a presentation my brother and I gave at an international symposium on the White Album in Monmouth, New Jersey in 2018. And this again indicates how seriously the Beatles are taken by the world of scholarship these days. Yes, there was an international symposium on the White Album, and we were happy to be there as presenters. So the subtitle of the presentation is called "The Folly and Utility of Categorization," and you'll see why we subtitled that in a few moments. So this slide is some shameless self-promotion that shows our book that my brother Hugh and I edited. It's a series of collections about how, series of essays about how various instructors around the country and around the world teach courses about the Beatles. So our book is both about what we can teach students about the Beatles and actually what the Beatles can teach us about teaching, thinking, and life. And that's where the subtitle comes in a little bit later. So one thing that we start off with discussing with our students is that before the White Album in 1968, the Beatles had released a number of LPs and singles that were innovative, but they were pretty approachable. I don't want to say mainstream because they were always innovative and different, but they weren't as different as the White Album was. They were putting a new spin on existing musical forms, and they were performing successful experiments. And then if you look on the right side of this slide, it says the White Album, on the other hand, had continued the theme of innovation, but some of the songs were kind of alienating. I think it's something like Revolution Number 9 or Why Don't We Do It in the Road. Those were different for the Beatles in the sense that they were sort of alienating their audience a little bit, or some members of their audience, I should say. They were exploring many new musical forms in this album. The Beatles had been doing this their entire career, but they went to kind of to extremes on the White Album. And some of the experiments are usually considered unsuccessful by many listeners and critics. And again, I point to the sound concrete or musique concrete sound collage of Revolution Number 9 here. And one of the criticisms of the album is while it's clever in its use of parody and satire, sometimes they might be going a little too far in this regard. So that's why, again, it can be a shock to the system, to students who have been used to listening to the Beatles up until this point, because we usually teach the course chronologically. So that because of this, some of the negative student reactions is, oh, they got lazy on this album. They were taking too many drugs. It's the beginning of the breakup of the group. Things like that. And really, some of these are partially true. They were certainly taking a lot of drugs, although they were never high when they were recording. They were on drugs to inspire the writing of some of their songs. They were perhaps getting a little bit lazy, although they were always very disciplined as writers and performers, but they were perhaps giving themselves a little more individual leeway rather than working as a group. And the beginning to the end is true to a certain extent because there were a lot of tensions during the recording of the album that did hasten the group's demise. Now, on the other hand, some students love the variety of the album. There are 30 tracks on the double album, and they are all over the place, from straight ahead rock and roll to folk to blues parodies. Again, to experimental tracks, to like music based on 1920s music. It is literally all over the place. There's classical influences here. They love the craziness of the album. It is a truly crazy album. There's all sorts of nutty stuff going on and a lot of fun stuff. The Beatles are taking on multiple musical personas on the album. One of the things that students get a little confused of is they hear a song like Why Don't We Do It in the Road, written and performed by Paul McCartney, and they think it's a John Lennon song because of the way it's presented and the kind of song it is. And then a song like Julia that John Lennon wrote and performed is more like a McCartney song, really gentle and melodic. And they just weren't afraid of anything. This is true of the Beatles their entire career. They were always experimenting. Even though they were at the top of the game, they were not content to keep repeating a successful formula. So then, how do you approach the White Album as an instructor or as a teacher? And that's the big question. And we wrestled with that, and we came up with some approaches that I'm going to share. So this figure on the right is Jeremy Hillary Boob. For those of you who are fans of the Beatles, you know he's a character who appears in the film Yellow Submarine, and he has a PhD of all things, and he's very intentionally named because he's very intelligent and intellectual. But the Beatles, or the producers of the film Yellow Submarine, were making fun of how academics behave. So anyway, like Jeremy Hillary Boob, many academics enjoy categorizing. And if you remember, the subtitle of the presentation is The Follies of Categorization. So we're going to get into some possible ways you can categorize the 30 songs on the White Album. And we freely admit that sometimes we appear as pretentious and foolish as Jeremy Hillary Boob when we attempt to do this. So here you see a frazzled professor type in the illustration. So one approach to teaching the White Album is to create a spreadsheet to organize our thoughts and to try to categorize the songs. And that's what this next slide after this one shows. And as you can see, I intentionally chose this graphic because we've got all sorts of different wires and we're trying to connect up to create one coherent connection. So the type font here is pretty small because I wanted to fit the entire spreadsheet on the screen, so you probably can't read it really well, but what it does is it takes each of the 30 songs on the White Album, again, a double album, the only double album the Beatles recorded, and it lists the song and then who the main composer was, what kind of instrumentation was used in the song, whether it's considered traditional or not, whether it's a genre parody, and related to that, who it's sending up. So, for example, back in the USSR, the first track was composed by Paul. It has rock instrumentation. It's traditional in the sense that it follows basic rock music structure. It is a parody of a genre, in this case, surf music, and specifically it's sending up the Beach Boys. So you can see with these 5 fields that we're kind of slicing and dicing, categorizing the album again. And this is one way that we present the album to the students because they want to be able to divide it up so they can start analyzing it. So I'm going to go over a couple of these approaches. Excuse me. So one is by composer. Here we have a picture of the Fab Four themselves. And so most people think John's songs on the album show anger, individuality. They parody other performers or types of music, and they're very experimental. Paul's songs have a lot of whimsy, sentimentality, although they also parody other groups and types of music, and they're pretty bucolic. George's songs are full of sarcasm, spirituality, and humor, which are 3 main elements of George Harrison's personality. So then another way of categorizing is by instrumentation style. So there's some very hard rock in here, like Helter Skelter. The Beatles wanted to make this the loudest track ever recorded. They were inspired by The Who's song released in 1967, I Can See for Miles, that had been called the loudest song, and they wanted to outdo them. There are lots of pop sort of songs on here. A good example is Martha, My Dear, Paul McCartney composition. And then there's also a lot of folk instrumentation on the album, typified by John Lennon's track Julia, which he wrote about his mother. One way that people have approached the White Album very often is by how it parodies certain musical genres. Surf music is parodied in uh, the first track of the album, which I already mentioned, back in the USSR. Ska is a form of reggae, and Obladi Oblada is sort of a parody of that. Country music is parodied in a couple tracks on the album, including Rocky Raccoon and Ringo's only contribution to the album, Don't Pass Me By. What's called cock rock, excuse the vulgar language there, is typified by Why Don't We Do It in the Road. White Men Singing the Blues is typified by a song called Your Blues, written by John Lennon, that's on the album. There's a lullaby in the album called Good Night, which is the last track of the double album. And then music of the 20s is also parodied with Paul McCartney's track Honey Pie. So this gives you a sense of how many different genres they're kind of poking fun at. And again, they're not only doing parodies and satires, but they're kind of sending people up. I mentioned already, Paul McCartney sends up the Beach Boys, even though he admired the Beach Boys, especially Brian Wilson, in his track Back in the USSR. John Lennon is sending up the NRA, National Rifle Organization, in Happiness is a Warm Gun. George Harrison is sending up the Rich in his song Piggies. John Lennon is sending up the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, with whom they studied in India, and where many of the songs that appeared on the White Album were written, in the song Sexy Sadie. And then a traditional British blues figure whose name is John Mayall. John Lennon is sending up his sort of white man singing the black man's music, the blues, in the song Your Blues. So then, once we've presented all these categories to the students, then we start letting the students debate, and we hold class discussions of, do the categories that we've created work, or are they artificial and they don't work? And that depends on the class. My brother Hugh and I have both taught the course on many, many occasions, and it really varies a lot from class to class, how they react to the categories that we've sort of imposed on the album as true academics like Jeremy Hillary Boob. One of the distinctions that we make is whether a song is a tribute or a parody. For example, in Honey Pie, is Paul McCartney doing a parody of 1920s music, or is it a tribute to 1920s music because he likes that kind of music so much? He actually says, as an aside in the song, I like this kind of music during Honey Pie, for example. Don't Pass Me By, Ringo's country track. Ringo loved country music, so it's really more of a tribute to country music than it is a parody. Many people think of Good Night, as I mentioned earlier, as a parody of a lullaby, but John wrote it for his son Julian, so in a sense, he meant it seriously as well as a tribute. And then, as I said, Back in the USSR is a parody of the Beach Boys and surf music, but Paul McCartney also liked that kind of music. So it's very tricky, this fine line between, is a song a tribute or a parody? So by trying to impose academic order onto an artistically chaotic album, we reach a teachable moment. And this is where we get back to how we're not only teaching the students about the Beatles, but the Beatles are teaching us things about ourselves and about art. And that's where we come to this great quote from the Tao Te Ching. Ancient wisdom is that the greatest form has no shape. So what students end up realizing sometimes is, even though they've tried to pick apart the album and change it and categorize it, that perhaps we should just leave it alone, and that, again, the greatest form has no shape itself, so that let's not try to do something artificial to art and ruin it in that sense. So it's sort of a tricky balance again. So what we ask students to do is to play George Martin. And for those of you who don't know, George Martin was the producer of the Beatles. So by skewing the tight structure of their previous albums, did the Beatles create a new kind of masterpiece in the 1968 double album, The White Album? or would it have been superior as one disc? Up until this point, the Beatles had created albums that varied between 10 to 14 songs instead of a double album of 30 songs. So what we do is George Martin, the producer himself, wanted to make it a single album. He thought a lot of the tracks were kind of extraneous and of not high enough quality to be included on the album. And so he wanted to pare the album down from 30 tracks to 14 or 15. So then we asked the students to do the same thing. We asked them to choose which of the 30 songs would they eliminate to make it a stronger or more coherent album of only 14 tracks instead of the 30 that the Beatles did actually release. And that kind of result shows a fun thing to do is we see how the students actually react to this assignment and whether or not they are happy with the 30 tracks or whether they want to go to the 14 or 15 tracks, making it a single album. And it's very interesting to see how they choose their various tracks. Some of them want to stick with the straight ahead rockers because they prefer that. And so they choose their tracks based on that kind of category. Some like the variety, and so they want to stick with some rock, some folk, some tributes or parodies. And others take completely different approaches. They like a lot more of the John Lennon songs or the Paul McCartney songs. They might not like the George Harrison songs, and so they get rid of his 4 contributions to the album. So they're all over the place, and it's a fascinating exercise for the students and for the instructors to look at later. So anyway, that's a very short but also complex way to look at how the Jenkins brothers end up teaching the 1968 double album masterpiece, officially named The Beatles, but affectionately known as The White Album. So I hope you've learned a thing or two. As always, feel free to contact me if you have further questions about anything in my presentations, especially the Beatles. And with that, I will sign off for today. Thank you for listening.